And I love the idea, and it sounds a bit nuts, I know, but of treating video games like we treat learning a foreign language. We'll be cheering on our kids as they do that, and be wanting to know, how are they improving, how are they progressing in it, and being ambitious for the experience, and not settling for, not that Fortnite's bad, but not settling for Fortnite and Minecraft, but knowing there's more out there.
This is the Humans of Gaming podcast, an open and honest conversation about games, life, and belief.
Welcome back to Humans of Gaming. I'm Drew Dixon, and I did say welcome back because I know you've been listening diligently to every episode from day one, so thank you. And if you haven't, go back. There's some good ones. There's some great ones in the backlog. Go listen to them. But I'm the chief content nerd at Love Thy Nerd, and also one of the co-founders of Love Thy Nerd. I'm joined with Chris Waltney, who co-hosts the show. Hey, Chris.
What's happening? I am Chris. I have not been here for every episode of Humans of Gaming.
That's true.
Anyway, welcome. We're super glad you're here. Otherwise, it would just be us talking to ourselves, and that doesn't sound very fun. So anyway, you're here. Humans of Gaming, where we like to have designers, developers, content creators, all kinds of gaming industry folks on to talk about the things they do and the importance of those things, and also just kind of get to know them as people so we can hear what makes them tick. So this episode, we had Andy Robertson from Taming Gaming and the what's it called? Family Game Database. And it was
Taming
super
Gaming
cool.
is the database. Yeah. If you go to taminggaming.com, you can find this database. It's so cool. It's this massive database of so many games that are recommended for kids, families, people based on all kinds of different values. So if you want a game that's going to bring a little calm in your life, you might be listening to this and thinking like, games bringing calm, isn't that like an oxymoron or something? That doesn't exist, but it actually does.
That's what my wife would say.
And there's a list for that. Anyway,
honestly, like if you're a parent and you're listening to this right now, like just pause it and go to taminggaming.com.
Yeah.
Because it is seriously one of these resources that I'm like, why don't more people know about this? Why don't more people use this? Because it is super freaking cool.
Yes, it's awesome. And Andy's done just some really valuable work in that parenting space. You may have run into him as Geek Dad Gamer on like Twitter or YouTube. He's done so many. He has a TED Talk on spirituality and video games. And it's just done a lot of really interesting work in this space, and like ultimately wants to help parents and families like love gaming and game together and game in ways that are valuable. As much as like you and I think are proponents of video games, like I think we also are like super aware that they cause a lot of problems in homes. And there's a lot of parents that are like just at their wits' end when it comes to video gaming. And so if that's you, like this conversation, I think will encourage you to be a better parent, to love your kids better, and also to like figure out some strategies, some ways that gaming doesn't have to be this like constant battle in your home. It can actually be a source of connection between you and your children. You can actually set limits without crushing their spirits. You can do it. And you're well poised to do it. Because no one loves your kids like you do.
That's right.
And Andy can help. So
Andy, this was the first time I've ever heard a parent say, like at one point during the show, he said something like, "I'm a good dad." And it kind of took me aback. I was like, well, you're a conceited son of a gun is what you are. But no, it was such this beautiful, simple, like quietly confident sort of like, it's also something you can tell he has worked incredibly hard at. And, I think, man, the things you can learn from this guy are invaluable. Now, all that said, if you're not a parent and you're listening to this, that's okay too. I'm not a parent. And I have learned a tremendous amount from Andy and the conversation we got to have with him. So, I think it's still valuable, even if you're not a parent.
So yeah, I hope this really encourages you. Also get to hear a little bit about Andy's story and his journey and stuff, and just who he is, like all that good stuff that we always get into on this show. So yeah, without further ado, I very much hope you love this conversation with Andy Robertson. Yeah, it's we've talked about it, I feel like, for a while, and certainly like, we've known you for, feels like a long time now. I feel like we've been bumping into each other a lot on the internet for years now, in good ways. Like, I think we've bumped into each other in helpful ways. We've collaborated on some articles on Love Thy Nerd, and you're certainly someone whose work we've appreciated and gained insight from for a long time. So it's cool to have you on.
Yeah, it's good. And I've, you supported projects I've done and promoted the book when I was trying to make that happen, played a part in that. And I remember Love Thy Nerd launching, and yeah, the excitement, the reveal of the name and all that kind of stuff. It was cool.
Cool. Well, thanks for following us. We appreciate it. So yeah, how would you frame what you do in the world of video games for our listeners?
So I just describe myself as a journalist, but specializing in this intersection between families and video games. And that kind of was unintentional. I made the jump to journalism from being a technical author around the time that the Wii was coming out. And so
when you say technical author, like, what do you mean?
So I used to write like online help for tax software. So like the little articles that would pop up. If you're like, looks like you're trying to do a tax return. Let me help you. Clippy. Sort of.
So you were like Clippy. You were the Clippy, but for taxes.
That was.
I didn't know we had Clippy on here. This is amazing.
Incredible.
So, but it was still writing. I enjoyed it because it was writing, but it was pretty dry. And I realized, I could write about video games in a similar kind of way, in some ways. And so developed that as a hobby, and then jumped across. And when that happened, the Wii was there, and so there was a kind of an appetite, I guess, for people to write about this experience of families and video games. And I had kids that were at the right age. They must have been 5, 6, 7-ish sort of age at the time, and so and it was kind of weird because I quite quickly got picked up by Wired, which at the time I didn't realize was a big deal, really, because they had this Geek Dad blog. And they were looking for dads to write about games across the world, and they had some US writers, so that the UK angle was good. And so I made my start there, and I'd quite like to write some more for Wired now, but I've realised how hard it is to get something. It's a hard pitch, and it feels like I had this lucky break at the start.
You had this golden opportunity, and you didn't realize it was quite so golden.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, okay, where did you go from here? And they're like, most people are like, I don't know.
So was your first writing gigs in video games were all mostly from that angle, or did you do some like straight up normal, whatever, that's normal is the wrong word, but just regular old video game writing in the early days?
Kind of
it was usually, that was the sort of stuff I was kind of mopping up, the stuff that people didn't want to do. And that's kind of part of the story. I had a friend who was running Nintendo Life, which is now a big site, but at the time it was kind of a smallish site, and I kind of knew the guy who set it up. I don't know how, online somewhere, and he was saying, I've got this Madden game on the Wii, but no one will review it. And I was like, I'll review it. I'd never written a game review before. So he sent me the game, I did the review, which is quite fun, got some friends over, took some pictures.
Great. They invited someone from the UK to write a review of Madden.
Yeah, I was like, what's this weird? This isn't football. It's something weird. And then at the end, I was like, okay, well, where do I send the game back to? I've done it now. And then they were like, oh, no, you can keep the game. And so I sort of was like, oh, really? Oh, that's interesting. I might do this again. And really, that's kind of what got my attention, was this idea that you could write a review for a relatively small site online, and there was review copies of the game that sort of circulating. And so I kind of spent basically a couple of years writing for lots of different, very small sites. And so most of those, as I was saying, was mopping up kind of the family stuff that no one else wanted to write about. But there were some more kind of straightforward stuff. And then I got about 2 years into that. It was like, perhaps there's some money in this, or perhaps I could do it full time, but I couldn't really tell without going full time. So my wife was up for it, and I had a mortgage and young kids. So I quit the job and started being a full time.
I want to know what that conversation was like How did that, like, what? Because that, I don't know. I think there's a lot of people out there that would hear that and be like, well, it must be nice, or they're even thinking about it for themselves, like making this huge leap. Cause that's a pretty big leap. Like, what was that transition like? What was that conversation with your wife like? Your own reflection.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the difficulty is it's hard to know what that looks like. So when you're in a salary job, you've got money coming in every month, and really, regardless of kind of what you do, obviously you need to do the work, but there's money there. And it wasn't obvious, well, where's the money going to come from? But at the same time, it was like, well, I'm never going to know that unless, unless I try it. And I think I'd watched the film Revolutionary Road with Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio, and there's a story about not taking your chance or taking your chance, and that was kind of instrumental actually in thinking, actually I just need to go for it. And I'd saved up quite a bit of money from the freelance writing, so I had probably half a year's salary. So if I made no money, I think that was part of the conversation. Look, we can do this for half a year. If I make nothing for half a year, we'll be okay, and then I can go and get another job. But that's a challenge, I think, not knowing what was there. And I thought I wanted to be sort of the editor of a magazine. I felt like that was maybe the top job. And quite soon after quitting the job and going into the industry, I realized that really the people who were running those magazines at the time were probably in their 20s in a shared flat somewhere, and were getting, not enough money.
Horribly unhappy and depressed. And,
no, I don't know if they're happy or not, but they certainly weren't earning enough money to support a family and a mortgage. And so I had to.
I had a similar realization. I think I wanted to do that too, and then I realized the people who were like quote unquote making it as games journalists were not in the stage of life that I was in, and also like worked their tails off. I mean, it's a lot of work for not a lot of pay, and I think in general that's the case. It's just journalism is just so different now than it used to be in general, I think. But it's maybe even more true in the world of video games when there's so much competition. There's so many people that will write an article just for getting a free game. Like you. I used to be that way too. Like, oh, you're going to give me a free game? Amazing.
You guys are part of the problem. Come on.
We are, definitely. Yeah, that's that tension, isn't it? We established journalists, often I hear say, what should you do? And like, oh, we should never work for free, which is kind of easy once you're established. It's a bit like the kind of developed nations saying to the developing nations, this is probably the wrong phrase to use, but you shouldn't burn coal, and because we've done it, and so we're here where we are because we've kind of done that. And so it feels a bit funny. And my take would be, you just got to find a way in, and whatever it takes, and if that takes your foot in the door and do some free stuff, I think you need to know your own boundaries and limits. And I think that what I soon realized is that everybody was doing the same thing. Like, everybody was reviewing a game and scoring out of 10, and it really saying a very similar thing about this game over and over and over. Which is fine. It was quite nice. It's a nice community, and it's there's a little bit of nuance in each one. But I really wanted to find something different to say. I wanted to sort of treat this as more than just something you'd score out of 10, and so that was kind of a driver to try and work out how to do that. And I think that's where the sort of games industry, whether it's journalism or not, but there's a lot of space to try things. And if you get lucky, then you can make some money. So kind of if you try 10 things in a year, then hopefully one of those will stick, and then you get paid. And that was kind of a model that I've kind of used, I guess, is try a lot of things, be in a position so I can try things and persist at trying them for, say, 6 months, where I know most people would maybe stop after a week. And then usually one of those turns into something which then has value like a year later. And so, but there's some fortunateness about that, because I could have easily have tried that and ended up with not getting enough value come back soon enough. And then eventually I would have run out of money and would have gone and got a different job, I guess. But going from one thing to the next kind of worked for me. And I think that came more from essentially being an entrepreneur rather than a writer. So I think that side of my personality was well suited to it, as well as being able to be able to write relatively well, was having that sort of duck and dive, find the angle, what should we do next, and that sort of thing, and also spot things like part of my story is a YouTube channel and sort of getting lucky with something, but then why was that lucky, and really being willing to double down and commit to those lucky moments to see where they're going to go.
That's something that I think is easily overlooked, is like the data part of it, or the analytics part of it is like, because it's one thing to, let's take YouTube, for example, and you upload 10 videos, 9 of those videos have 100 views, and then one of them has 1,000 views. And you could just continue on and be like, oh, cool. Like one of those got 1,000 views. Like that sounds nice. But like I think the next step is to go look at it and say, okay, spot the difference, right? Like what was the difference from this one to the other 9, looking into those things. Like, I think that's something that can kind of take things up a level, which sounds like maybe kind of what you're saying is like going back and looking at some of those things and trying to replicate or expand even on some of those ideas.
Yeah. And then the challenge is whether you can scale enough of your effort to sort of get enough data that's interesting. So, and if you see this a lot on YouTube, someone will get a lucky video and then you'll see them try to replicate it 3 or 4 times. And the subsequent videos have got like, very few views compared to the hit. But if you're in a position where you can keep doing that for 6 months, then suddenly, whether you're hitting or not, you're suddenly getting a lot of data back. And that was the pattern for me and the Family Gamer TV channel that I've had, is that getting lucky with some Skylanders content, but then basically spending kind of 2 years doing like a video, almost a video a day. I say that now. I think I'm sure it feels like that can't be true, but that's what I've always been saying. And I think that was what it was like for a while, which is just really heavy lifting. But every time you did a video, you got more information back, both from the algorithm, what was popular, so like length, time of day, and all that kind of stuff, tagging, but also from viewers. And I've always like read the comments. We often will say people say never read the comments, but I think they're gold dust. That's particularly if they're engaged viewers. And the channel that I ran was for kids, so I would have comment, like you wouldn't do now because you'd turn comments off if it was content for kids. But at the time, the kids would be like, "Oh, that's a great video, but what would happen if this Skylander figure turned up at school, or what happened if someone buried it?" And they had these, and I'd often just do those things. And then those were the videos that were popular. So I think that kind of, not the sort of the hard data, but also the soft data as well. Those comments are really useful.
Yeah. So you have the YouTube channel. Are you still like actively doing video stuff on there? Not once a day, but
I it's still active, but I'm not. It's not my main income, so I'm not grinding at that, which is kind of lovely. I did it from like 2012 to like 2018, 2019. And it's hard. It's a hard space to be in. Yeah. And I feel for those kind of young content creators. Sort of the parent, the fatherly part of me feels like, who's in the room for them? Have they got the support? Like, what's the network there? Particularly when they come a cropper and so they do something they shouldn't. I'm like, well, where was the adult? Like, they should have had an adult. They hadn't. So I'm sort of that sort of grind. I'm happy to be away from, but I still do videos.
I feel about. It's the same feeling I have with Twitch. I mean, I remember Twitch. That's kind of what got me into like doing what we do with Love Thy Nerd. Was I discovered Twitch, a decade ago or whenever that was. And there were these, kids on there, 17, 18-year-old kids streaming to 40,000 people and making doctors' salaries. And they acted the way you would think a 17 or 18-year-old would act that's making that kind of money playing video games for a living.
Yeah.
And I had those same thoughts of like, oh my God, like where's their parents? Like what?
Yeah.
And the thing that sucked the most about it is that they've got 40,000 captive viewers that will then mimic that behavior, or like they look up to them as an idol or something to replicate. And I mean, that still exists today and probably always will. But that's something that really motivated me, was like, okay, we can be better. Like we can do better stuff, more meaningful. It makes me think of what you were saying about like, we can write reviews. We can give, 9 out of 10, 8 out of 10 or whatever. But like, is there more? Because there's something deeper that we can do. Like, is that kind of for you with the YouTube channel and other stuff like a motivator?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think on YouTube, the thing is what you decide not to do. So there's always 3 or 4 things other similar channels are doing, and they're going to be quite successful. But then the question is, do I want to do that? And in the sort of, I ended up with Skylanders and that kind of stuff being in sort of the kids' toy space. And some of the stuff, would be terrible. And actually that was easy because you'd just be like, I'm not going to do a video with this scenario. I don't even want to describe it here because it's just so weird. But then there's other,
we're talking like Skylanders fan fiction, or what are we talking about here?
Do you want to go into it? There was a period when I was doing videos where it's like kids doing stuff that adults do, but doing it wrong. And that started with kind of flushing stuff down toilets where there's obviously real kids doing it, but probably being filmed by adults. But then there was stuff like kids shaving for a while, and it would be play shaving. But then and sometimes there'd be ketchup but sometimes some of those videos you couldn't tell if the child was injured or not. Yeah. And those are the ones which are really popular. And injection videos, like where kids, or like you have some toys played with, and suddenly the toy gets injured, and then a real hand comes in with a big needle or a pair of pliers and pulls a tooth out, and all that stuff. Because I think basic content creators had realized if we scare children, then they'll keep watching, and that helps our views stuff. So as a content creator, you do look at that and think, well, could I do a sanitized version of that? But I'm really happy to have, I think, stayed away from that. But that, which did keep the channel kind of at a lower level. So a lot of it is kind of deciding what not to do in a YouTube space, as much as sort of finding the new novelty stuff. But by deciding not to do stuff, you obviously free up time.
Does that discourage you some? Like, like you could have. Do you ever think like, oh man, I could have like tripled my viewership if I would pretend to pull a tooth out or something and shave and have fake blood going down my face?
Yeah. I think it's definitely you're aware that not doing that has impact. But I think as an adult, that there's a very short term gain there. And I've always been, I've never sort of stepped away from being kind of a grown up with some authority in the game space in terms of offering advice. And so I know that going down that very questionable route on YouTube would have impacted other areas of my work. So I had this kind of helpful kind of belt and braces kind of check to stop me doing anything too stupid.
Yeah, it's called a conscience. You have one of those.
Yeah, probably that's it. Even if it's
or a soul, you just have a soul.
Yeah. So on the YouTube side, but then on what more, since sort of moving away from YouTube a bit, is kind of then being thinking more about parents and like what advice do they need, what isn't happening in that space, and realizing that they were kind of being got at from both sides. The kind of pro tech would be like, you need to use technology to raise the aspirations of your child and give them the opportunities, and they need to learn that programming is the new Latin and all that kind of stuff. But then on the other side, if you let your child have too much screen time, then you're battered from this side. And kind of parents were in the middle. And then there was nobody really sort of saying, what do you do? Well, while this debate is kind of raging of like, are games good or bad? And obviously that's a long conversation that's going to take many years. In terms of impacts in childhood, what do the parents who've got children now do? And that's what I was hearing from parents. It's like, well, I don't really care what the reality is. I just want some advice now. My kids are growing up now. What do I do now? And so that was a motivator for this book I've written, and then the database that goes with it. And again, that's been nice because I wouldn't have done it if I'd had if there was something else to point to. And so it's quite exciting.
You were one of the first voices I recall like hearing from on a somewhat regular basis of someone who is speaking into that space of parenting and video games in a way that wasn't like fearful and reactionary. I think so much when it comes to not just video games, but screen time in general and technology in general. Like we live in this culture that's rapidly embracing technology, but it's also like there's very little nuance in the takes on. We're all like really afraid of it. But also like embracing it pretty much wholesale. And so anyway, I just have always really appreciated your voice as one that's more hopeful and more nuanced, I think, when it comes to video games and parenting. And I think I'd highly recommend people checking out your book. It's called Taming Gaming. You want to say more about it?
So I mean, I think what kind of runs through all this for me is this kind of secret knowledge that video games are actually media, and they're actually something that is good for people of all ages. And so once you know that, you've got this kind of secret source of information you can essentially put in the hands of parents, and it's going to transform how they see video games, how they see their children playing video games, but then also their relationship with those. It really diffuses that parents against the kids in the games, where the parents are kind of hoping that the kids are going to grow out of it. So that kind of thinking, like, what do those parents need? What they really need is kind of quite a deep literacy about what games are, because they're really scared of them. And parents I take through this kind of process, and part of it is really finding games that the parent themselves might want to play. And that will sound ridiculous usually when I say it. I say it sometimes in school sessions, and I'll often be stopped by a mum or a dad who'll say, "Oh, I love what you're saying. I want to engage with my kids. And yeah, I know that they love games, but can I just tell you, I'm never going to play a game because I don't like shooting things." And they're for kids, aren't they? Yeah. And the other parents, quite understandably, would kind of nod and be like, "Oh yeah, they'll go out of it," or something like that.
Yeah. I had a conversation like that with a friend recently who was kind of at his wit's end with one of his children. He and his wife both are. And he's actually at a place where he was like asking me questions like, should I buy a Switch? And would that be a good thing to do with my kids? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. But I said, his wife is the one that's particularly at odds with their children. And I said, yeah, I mean, you really should encourage her to find something she could play with them. And he said, oh, she would never, never do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it feels like what's the word? Like, it feels like an admission or something of defeat for her, I think.
Well, I think this may be too extreme of an example, but I think maybe there are some that view it this extremely, it's like your kid's doing drugs. And they're like, well, you just got to get in there and engage with them. Like, you got to shoot up with them. You got to get in there and, do that with them. Like, I legitimately think there's probably some parents that feel the same way. Like, no, what? They need to stop doing it. Like, that's horrible for them. It's horrible for everyone around them. Like, no, you don't engage with them. Like, stop it.
Yeah. And then the exciting thing is that they're not drugs. And so that's just amazing to be walking around with that knowledge that games are actually this media that everyone can enjoy. And in those conversations in the schools, often a mum would come up to me afterwards and we talk a bit more. She'd usually want to push back a bit, like, how can you have this advice, sort of thing. I'd be like, well, let's go on a journey. And I had these games which were really good at getting people into playing something who had never played games before and were quite reluctant. And so
what games?
So like Bury Me, My Love, the iPhone game about refugees, Wilmot's Warehouse, the kind of organising warehouse game, That Dragon Cancer. And it just, it's easy to tend towards the kind of morbid games, but those games with a really serious topic are good at signposting the fact that these obviously aren't for kids, and that's not why I'm recommending them. Like most parents will be like, oh yeah, I tried Candy Crush, yeah, I don't like it, but they put these games in their hands, and they go and play it, and then they would come back and when I was in the school, another time, and find me and say, oh, that game you got me to play. Oh, it was quite good. It wasn't what I thought. Yeah, I really quite enjoyed it. But the interesting thing was that they would then say, but what happened was my kids realized I was playing. And then they were talking to me about the game and asking me questions. And I was asking them questions about their game. And we had this completely different conversation about games. And suddenly I was this insider, they would say. And there was this phrase that I'd hear, not exactly the same, but it's very similar. A mum saying something like, and you know what? I feel like I've got my boys back. And they'd say that, and they'd hear themselves say that, and it would actually be quite emotional. Some of them, would be in tears. And that's kind of what I was trying to capture in the Taming Gaming book, and then with the database, is just putting those kind of games in the way of parents who haven't played, so that they can kind of fall into them, and take some very simple steps towards seeing themselves as someone who might play games, and that might be part of their future, and that kind of sets them on this path, and they're kind of off then. In some ways, a lot of those families, if particularly if the kids are younger, they don't need much more than that. They want what else should we play, and that kind of sort of stuff can help. But then, they're part of it.
What's up, nerd? You digging this podcast? Well, the audio enjoyment doesn't end there. Visit ltnonair.com and make LTN Radio your new go-to for the best Christian rock, rap, pop, and indie, as well as our exclusive LTN shows and podcasts, some of which air on the station before they're available anywhere else. Visit ltnonair.com to listen now and find the link to our app. Now back to the show.
Tell us about the database.
Yeah, so the book was delayed because of COVID printing delays. So I started creating what I thought would be quite a small little promotional website. The book doesn't have an index, and so I had all these recipes, these game recipes in the back, which is the way I was sort of helping parents discover games. So I was like,
cookbook.
We'll create, a gaming cookbook. We'll create a little website about it. And my friend could make databases, so he was like, "Oh, we'll make a database because then they'll be searchable." And so we did that. And in the book, the games are kind of grouped into themes, like games for those parents who never played games before, but then games where you go into the wild or survive the night or go on an adventure, that kind of stuff. And one of those lists was games that help you find calm. So that was one of the lists we created on the website, and that just became really popular very quickly because it was in the UK. It was kind of I guess worldwide. It was early COVID, and lots of parents were seeing kids playing games, and I guess we're quite worried about that. And to hear the fact that maybe they're not just misbehaving, but that actually this is part of their coping with what's going on in the world in this sort of chaotic time, and these games were actually maybe helping them, was a breath of fresh air, I think, for them, which made it was popular, and it got a little bit of funding, and so one thing led to another, and it's basically the database has become my big kind of project that takes up most of my time now with a bit of funding, and has like 1,300 games on it, and you can search in loads of different ways, and we've had some funding to add accessibility search for it, and you can do a really detailed, you can like stuff like if you're worried about loot boxes, you can say, I don't want games with loot boxes. You can pick how many players, how old they are. Games you can play with one button, games you can play without sight or without hearing, or games that don't put you on the clock. So it's just a sort of a discovery engine kind of for video games and it's all aimed at parents, so that we don't use any jargon. I very rarely say platformer. I'll say running and jumping game, which makes people laugh. But it's important not to use that kind of jargon that we think is so simple.
That's huge because I mean, it's funny, like we've collaborated on this a little bit because I recently started writing a book on parenting and video games.
Yeah.
So So that I think that is the biggest thing that one of the biggest things I think I would encourage parents to do is figure out how to get past their unwillingness to play games with their kids, like that. I think that would really be a game changer for a lot of parents because ultimately, like the things that you need to do as a parent because video games feel like there's, like you said earlier, platformer. Most parents don't know what we mean when we say that, platformer. It feels like this whole other world, and there's things like loot boxes that they see headlines about, and so they're worried about loot boxes, but they don't even know what those are. It just feels like this whole other world that feels so daunting, and they don't want to get into it. And so they think like, how can I possibly navigate this space with my kids? But in reality, like I think most parents are far better equipped to deal with this stuff than they think they are, because as a parent, like if you're a parent listening to this, no one loves your children better or more deeply, probably, hopefully better and more deeply than you do. And so like you actually have all the tools, you just need a little bit of help. And that's what I love about the work that you do is it's those little nudges and that little bit of information that parents need, that make something that feels so daunting and so like a problem that's impossible for them to fix. It makes it feel more attainable, more solvable, so that they can love their kids better.
And it is easier than it seems. I know that it seems like, I know I hear lots of parents say, I can never get ahead of the kids. They're so advanced. They grew up with this. They're natives. But the reality is that, half an hour a day, a couple of times a week, and you'll quite quickly, if you've got the right information, you'll quite quickly catch up and you'll be ahead. And like one of the things, and it can really change the conversation. And an example is, on the website now, on the database, we see thousands of parents Googling things like, is Call of Duty okay for a 12-year-old? And they can then come to the page, they get our rundown, and it's all aimed at parents. There's like one screenshot, and there's one video that's been pre-watched and starts just where the shooting starts. So in seconds, they can see what it's like. But then at the bottom, I know it's obviously got age ratings and stuff, we then have 20 or so other games that are shooting games that are ordered by age rating. So if you're saying no to Call of Duty, that's fine, but it's a very different thing to say no, but how about this? And when you do that once or twice, initially, my experience is that the kids are reluctant, and they're like expecting it to be some sort of educational game. But if they take your recommendation and try it and it's good, you've then got some equity in this space. And my kids actually will come, they'll come to me and say, I'm bored of my games. Can we find a game to play? And so if other parents overhear that, they're like, what just happened? Like, what did your child just say? And it seems like this kind of magic thing, but actually all it is just building up that kind of equity is the word I use in that of just sort of being a little bit ahead. And we're used to doing that in other areas, and we think it's impossible with video games. So it's really exciting to take a parent from kind of who's never played a game right through to kind of suggesting games for their child and it being a successful suggestion.
Where do you tell? I think you kind of mentioned this earlier, but I guess is it games like Bury Me in My Love and Wilmot's Warehouse and stuff? Is that where you tell most parents to start? If you have the parent who's coming to you and says like, okay, like I'll try something. All right, I'm like finally ready to try something. Is that where you point them, or where do you?
I think it's a real kind of it's a conversation that you really need to understand where they're at, what their interests are, what sort of books would they read, what would they watch on Netflix, and that then if you've got a wide range of games, I can either do some searching or they can and find something, or it's like, oh, I know you're into bird watching, aren't you? And you there's this game Alba on iPhone, and you actually it looks like a kid's game, but actually it's this great bird hunting game, and you kind of give them a bit of an intro to it, and I think a lot of it is actually that kind of. That introduction that gets them into it is as important. The sort of commentary that explains it and sort of like frames the game as something that might be interesting to an adult, and that kind of combination of that sort of prescription of a game, like a medical prescription, it needs to be tailored to who's playing. But you need to think, well, what technology have they got? I don't want to really. I want to exclude anything that uses two sticks at the same time and multiple buttons, and I don't want anything that's going to be very, very long. And so you have this kind of criteria. But some games are good in that area, but I haven't ever found like a one game fits all. Like Bury Me in My Love, I always think is a great place to start because it's so unusual and it's so kind of light touch. But I've just been trying that with a dad recently, and he's like, "Oh, I got bored." That was my favourite suggestion. So we need something with a bit more, a bit more sort of tactile,
a bit more action packed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I found myself like I get that question a good amount from parents. It's like, all right, well, tell me what should I be playing, or what should I be playing with my kids, all those kinds of things, and it's really like. I found myself just going like, oh, you just need to go to Taming Gaming. Because I could give people recommendations, but it's such a massive space. That's the cool thing about your database is that there are, billions probably of video games out there now. And it's so hard to sort through them all. And so I think what you've done is incredibly valuable because, it just feels... And it's here one day and gone the next too, right? Like, there's for every Fortnite out there that sticks around and Minecraft that sticks around for years, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of worthy games that aren't just mindless time wasters, that nobody's playing because of the nature of the industry, or it's here today, gone tomorrow, but going back.
Sometimes it's here today and then gone today. It's so
Yeah.
quick. Like,
Yeah.
it's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so as a parent, you can really play a role in. It's quite easy to uncover stuff that your kids will love and that they've missed. So it's a genuine thing. You're not just kind of dipping in, but you can create this ongoing kind of oh
Mhm.
yeah, we need to spend some time, and also just encouraging them not to just go with the crowd and not just to. It feels like often in these conversations, it feels like as soon as you said Minecraft and ESRB rating, there's nothing else to say, as if those things answer everything. I think it's easy to
Yeah.
feel like we have one tick that's this is the way parents know what's in a game. This is the game to play if you're worried about games. That's it. But obviously, it's like because it's a media, it's more complicated than that. And so opening them up to the breadth of games, a short hike is another one I often recommend because it's just such an unusual experience. And the experience isn't what it looks like it will be. And I think that's kind of quite a nice thing for a parent to say, oh, there's this game. It looks really weird, but actually you might quite like it. And sometimes that works the other way around. I've had some parents I work with who actually play a game themselves. I had a dad who played Limbo and really connected to it and the sort of the story behind it and wanted to play it with his son, who at the time was probably 12 or 13. And he had this really back to front conversation where he described trying to convince his son to play it, and reassuring his son, it'll be okay, we'll be together. If it's too violent, then we'll stop. But it's just this really great game. It's really moved me and I really want to share it with you. Will you take a risk on it with me? Which is kind of, back to front in a really lovely way. And I think that kind of engagement just makes games, like normalizes them, anchors them as part of family life in a way that's really important if we're going to have a healthy long-term relationship with them.
Yeah. What are you most concerned about? I'm curious to hear, like, when it comes, because your book is hopeful about video games. And I think some people can hear that and go like, oh, well, you're just telling us to like embrace this world. And that's not at all what you're saying. Like you have concerns about the world of video gaming and you're really concerned with helping parents engage this and help their children develop responsible habits. And, what is the biggest concern for you with regard to parents and well, not so much parents, but kids in video games, and that you would want parents to be aware of?
Yes, I think it's important to sort of put in the room of the conversation that video game violence is really quite disturbing. And it's really violent. And like, we don't properly know what the effects of that violence are in long-term play. What we have is scientific studies that have a correlation between the violence and violent behavior, but not a causation. But the reporting obviously says video games make you violent when which came first. But that's where we are. And it's important to sort of just be open about that, to try and diffuse some of the headlines which are inaccurate, but also allow parents and children to talk about it and to be able to process it and think, oh, if it is violent, then I want to see that. I want to be around while that's happening so that my child can talk to me about it. And then there's, games are commercial. So big, expensive games or the big blockbusters are there to make money and to funnel children into, a few experiences to make money from them. And the sort of loot boxes and gambling is a concern of parents. So that's something I always want to talk about. And then playing with people you don't know online is kind of a third area that's important to talk about. And again, there's real dangers there. And I talk to various charities that have been set up because the child has, maybe been killed. Breck Foundation is a charity that I work with, and that, that's evidence that those things can go very wrong if you're not careful, or even if you are careful. And so I think having those things on the table is really important. But the thing I'm really worried about is how the reporting of those things disengage parents, because I think the real danger is that parents back off of games, either lock them down and feel like that's job done, we've made them safe, they only play them an hour a day. What harm can they come to in an hour a day? Which is a bit like, oh, they just play on the motorway for an hour a day, what harm on the freeway? They'll be fine.
Yeah.
It's only an hour, but that's not really made it safe. And also either sort of just let them get on with it without them, and let it become something which isn't part of normal life. And so that both means that there's the conversation, if something does happen in the game, maybe the child's less likely to tell you because they're worried that if last time I told mum or dad, they took the game away. So I'm not going to tell them again because that's just nuts. I want to keep playing this. I don't care what that guy's saying or whatever's happening. So that open conversation is really important. But also on the other side, kids don't then get parents the ambition that we bring to other areas of their life. And I love the idea, and it sounds a bit nuts, I know, but of treating video games like we treat learning an instrument or learning a foreign language, that will be enthusiastic and will be, we'll be cheering on our kids as they do that, and be wanting to know, how are they improving, how are they progressing in it, and being ambitious for the experience, and not settling for, not that Fortnite's bad, but not settling for Fortnite and Minecraft, but knowing there's more out there. And so that, I think that's the biggest danger, is that we miss this opportunity for video games to become something more. Yeah, and which I see other media has I have this little thing I'll say around comics and graphic novels. Like, I don't really read them because in my mind, and I think in society, they kind of have become synonymous with superheroes and sort of slightly juvenile storytelling, which is ridiculous because they are an amazing way to tell stories. But in some ways, we're missing that opportunity there. And I worry that video games will become synonymous with violence in the same way. And again, we'll miss out on this powerful storytelling and all the other stuff.
This week in nerdy news, this is LTNN. A new set of photos for the upcoming Disney Plus exclusive movie, Muppets Haunted Mansion, was released last week by Entertainment Weekly. One photo features Miss Piggy dressed up as Kermit, and Kermit dressed up as Miss Piggy, so I guess that toxic relationship is still a thing. Marvel's new animated MCU series, What If?, premiered last Wednesday with an episode featuring one slight change to the original Captain America movie's story that rippled out into an entirely different outcome, where Peggy Carter became the super soldier instead of Steve Rogers. A second promotional poster has been released showcasing a zombie apocalypse Avengers situation. Oh boy, forget shawarma. We're eating brains tonight. And lastly, the first official trailer for Y: The Last Man was released last week, showing the day that all men die except for one, Yorick Brown. This story follows an extremely popular comic series where the world's women find themselves struggling to rebuild and find the answers around the sudden, immediate death of all men on Earth. I'm going to call it right now, though. It's probably not going to give you the warm fuzzies that you think it would. That was This Week in Nerdy News. I'm Radio Matt, and this is LTNN.
So we've talked a lot about your work in the gaming space, and your work in parenting and your new book that people should totally check out, and your database. But we haven't really talked about you. Like, where did you grow up, and what was that like?
So I grew up in the UK, near the New Forest, which is kind of like southwest, that's sort of 2 hours out of London. In kind of a mixed up family. So it's my dad's second marriage. He had 3 kids from the first marriage, and then he had me and my brother, and our older siblings were around. So it was a really nice kind of rough and tumble kind of childhood. But then quite quickly, after sort of 8 years or so, he split up from my mum, and then we moved to another town. And I know it sounds strange, but I basically never saw him again. So that's the peculiar sort of pattern.
How did that, like, he just pieced out and was like kind of disconnected from you altogether? Or how did that come about?
So yeah, I mean, it's something. I have seen him a bit recently, but I've probably only seen him like 10 times or something ever.
Wow.
And it just, my sort of take on it is he just wasn't able to be there, and wasn't able to be the grown up in the room, perhaps, which probably informs my desire. In fact, on Twitter the other day, someone was tweeting, "What did your father teach you?" And what I replied was the importance of having a father, kind of ironically, because I think I'm a really good dad actually. Somehow, I'm not sure how that worked out. And then she was like, "Oh yeah, my dad's amazing." And I was, I wasn't there to make a point, but it was just, it helped me kind of reflect that.
By the way, like, I just want to say, I think that's healthy. What you just said. You said, "I think I'm actually a pretty good dad." Or I can't remember how you put it, but
yeah.
I like that you said that, because I think so many parents, and I live this way a lot too. I'm like, am I a good dad? Like, I have that question constantly. But I love
We
that you
too
can
often
say
equate good with perfect,
Yeah.
and that's just not the case.
Yeah.
That's just irrational.
Yeah, I think you're supposed to be good. I heard some stat. As long as you're good, something like 23% of the time, that's fine.
Oh, great, man! I am crushing it then.
Yeah. So there
Oh
you go.
yeah.
So, but I guess for me,
Cheers.
like just being that's probably the danger for me is like just the fact that I'm just here, I'm just around is kind of like a win. So that takes a lot of processing and a bit of therapy and some time in church, as you know, and
it all comes back to daddy issues at the end of the day. I'm learning.
Yeah, no, I remember coming to faith. My early sort of coming to faith stuff was around sort of the Father Heart of God era. So that was both emotional and I think quite helpful, actually. It meant that it put that on the table in a way that if I wasn't in that context, it would have just been left, and I would be dealing more with it now. I still am dealing with stuff now, obviously, but I think.
And when was that? Was that as a kid?
Yeah, that was. So I grew up in a Baptist church in the UK. And didn't properly come to faith until, I don't know if this is a meaningful reference point of the Toronto blessing. Is that a tool on your
radar? Is that like vineyard stuff?
Yeah, so it was the Airport Vineyard Church in Toronto that had like an outpouring of the Spirit, like a revival, and people would go and they would do weird stuff and they'd come back.
That was the whole like getting drunk with the Holy Spirit and all that kind of stuff, right?
Animal noises and
it
was real.
So I'm a part of we used to be a vineyard church. That like we were called Ventura Vineyard. We actually just recently changed our name like a month ago because we've not been, as long as I've been there, which is about 4 years, it's never been a vineyard church. And people would come expecting that and they'd be very disappointed. And then, they'd leave or whatever. But I've heard, because I've been there, I've heard from people about this exact thing. That's crazy because I've rarely talked to other people that even know what it is. So it's kind of interesting that somebody does.
I compare.
So were you like into that kind of stuff, like the animal noises and I don't know whatever else?
Well, yeah. So I was in church thinking, I grew up with it. I was like, this is probably true, but it's basically, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. It just carries on in the background. And then this kind of revival happened in the church, and I was like, I'll give this a go. Got prayed for and had some kind of tangible experience of sort of religious encounter, which certainly at the time made me think, this isn't just random like background noise. This is actually something which seems to be interested in me. And then part of that was this coming into kind of ministry around the Father Heart of God and that God Father figure sort of area, which I think was pretty healthy. It was pretty helpful. No, I don't know about healthy, but it was helpful. And so I sort of carried on in that kind of vein for a while, and happily I'd had a whole bunch of friends kind of in a similar stage. So we had a real nice kind of community group. So although we were at the church, we would see each other in the week and stuff, and kind of the spiritual life was just as much when we would go and watch a film together as it would be on a Sunday morning. Which I think kind of sowed some seeds, which meant that I don't really go to church now. I still consider myself a person of faith, but that kind of experience of community and not needing a Sunday meeting eventually, I think, had its way with me because it was such a powerful thing right at the beginning.
But what was it that kind of made you decide you didn't want to like go to church on a regular basis any longer?
Yeah, so I sort of tracked with it for a good long time, probably for 10, 15 years.
Okay.
But I think basically I was always there wanting this kind of renewal of like, isn't it about community? Isn't it about like activism and that kind of stuff? It's not about the Sunday, is it? And the churches would say that. But then we'd spend most of our money and time on the Sundays. And there was a guy who came to lead, and then he tried to change some stuff, and he tried to stop the Sundays for a while over the summer, and nobody liked that. And I had this realization that, oh gosh, you guys all love the Sundays. They're really what you need. Like, this is spot on, exactly how you love it, and it's really fulfilling. And it's not for me. And so there was a real just light came on, and I was like, oh, that's fine. Well, I'll go and do something else, and you guys can do this. That's great. I don't have to keep kind of banging my head against the wall. And then I sort of headed off. I think I thought I'd find or be part of some sort of youth church or, alternative church that kind of never really happened. And so I kind of just had to live with that kind of absence of church in a kind of a much bigger kind of network of friends. So that was
really interesting what you said there. Like, it kind of took me aback a little, because you said, I think sounds like a really healthy way, and I'm curious to dig into it, is like, oh, you guys like really enjoy the Sunday thing. It's not really for me, so I'm just going to go find something different. Like, that sounds great. But I feel like most people, especially Christians that have been raised with, the angry God in the sky that's going to smite them, like, mostly they just feel guilty and crappy. Like, oh, I should be ... Was there any element of that for you? Like guilt, like, oh, I really should be that? Because the way you just said it sounded idyllic to me. I wish we could view so many things that way. It was like, oh, that seems like really great for you. It's not for me. So, I'm going to go find the thing for me. Like, what was that process like?
Yeah, I think it wasn't, there was no kind of disgruntledness or fear or anger, really. It was just, and I think that probably is the result of the guy who came to lead the church, who was very embracing of that, and of having kind of a young cohort of people of a similar age who we already had this kind of life beyond the church anyway, that kind of mirrored what I'd had as a younger Christian in my kind of hometown. And so I kind of, I guess, had the confidence that, this is just church. This is just how we've made this up. This is how we're playing this game on Sundays. And it's quite a recent invention, the way we're doing it. So that's fine. For traditions to be alive and living, we need to reinvent them. And so I'd love to be part of the reinvention of whatever's next. And that was kind of the feeling, I think. It wasn't a abandonment of church. But to sort of continue the story, then what my experience was, then not being in the Sunday service meant you didn't have a reinforcing of a particular way of being a Christian, which did lead to much more challenging space of what do I believe, and is it just dependent on those people around me? And I did a theology degree with some friends who were at a similar stage. It was sort of distance learning over 2 years, and that helped me, but it helped I think disassemble the stuff that I thought I would never take apart, but at the same time put into my hands different ways of continuing to be a Christian in very different ways. Like I had, in that setting, it felt like this was the only way you could do it. And if you weren't here, people would talk about you in sort of sad tones. Oh, it's a shame, he used to be so on fire, and look, he doesn't even go to church anymore. It's so sad.
Yeah,
like, maybe he'll come back.
Yeah.
Let's pray now. That sort of thing.
I'll be honest, like that, like that. That sort of mentality was a big part of my spiritual formation, and I planted a church prior to what I do now. And that was totally the way we processed people leaving and stuff. In some ways, like, it wasn't that simple, right? It's never that simple, but there was a lot of processing of like, oh, well, let's pray for them, because since they left the church, we're not sure they're okay anymore spiritually, and I still, like, I hear your story, and I'll be honest, and I'll say like there's this nagging thing in my head that's like, oh, I should say something that will open Andy's mind to like how important church is. And I do think it's important. But I also, like, I really appreciate your honesty, and I appreciate what you're saying, because I think it should challenge a lot of us to rethink, like, what is it that we're doing in this time? And is it really serving our community well? Is it really building people up? Is it really sending people out into the world to love their neighbor well and like make a difference in the world? Or is it just like the thing that we do, or the thing that we've been convinced that we have to do? I think it's really valuable to step back and think about it carefully. And there's this American system of church, and maybe this way in the UK as well, but that we're just all like really like tied to in a way that feels almost like impossible to reimagine, you know?
Yeah.
Too far gone.
Yeah. And it feels like part of the story, that story for me is that the challenge is that that particular way of doing it has kind of colonized. This is ours. The Bible,
Yep.
Jesus, salvation, this is ours. If you can leave, but you're going to leave this stuff too. And so that was the challenge, was to move on from that space and to work out how I could keep those things with me. And that's really challenging. There at times there was real moments of kind of personal breakdown, really, where I was just like, what do I do? And I was fully in. So I had friends who had other parts of their life, I think, which helped them transition, maybe a sort of a wider family or other stuff going on, or other ethos, so they could kind of pivot and move into something new. But I was just stood on this evangelical church thing because I loved it. I was absolutely fully pot committed, if you play poker. All in. And so trying to then move away, it was like, the ground I'm standing on is changing. So that was a challenging transition, and it's made more challenging by that community saying this is the only way to do it, and this is the only ground to stand on. But what's exciting with the journey is that my discovery is that actually that's quite a recent invention, and there's loads of other ground here, and loads of other God's activity in lots of other places, and I get a chance to discover that.
Well, you're talking about leaving. I was gonna, just say like the social pressure is a major part of, because I think your story is not unlike many people's stories. That is their social everything is the church, and so to leave that is not just a set of beliefs or something like that. It's like it's their friends, it's their family. And because many churches are, like you said, hey, if you leave this thing, we're going to think less of you. That's the easiest way to say it. There's a whole lot of social anxiety and pressure and all kinds of things wrapped up in that.
Yeah. And I think then what was exciting was that as you do step out, that there are, you soon discover, it's like leaving home, I guess, that those traditions you had and the way you did Christmas and all these different things were kind of peculiar to your family. But there's this bigger, wider family, in the world that you can kind of discover. And that was really, that you don't know that before you step out, I think. And then my experience is that I found really valuable ways that I love that continue to hold me as a Christian in very different ways. And part of that is being able to really credit video games as a part of my spiritual life and journey, and be able to really it's not like I've got church and then I do some video games as well. It's actually because I haven't got like a weekly church thing. Actually, video games are one of the pillars, of kind of what keeps me connected to God and the world and other people.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
What games do that? Are there like specific titles for you, or what?
I don't think it's any particular game. It is more about this sort of practice of, at one level, granting myself permission to do something that's kind of worthless. And I love that kind of the idea that art is kind of like this worthless object or useless object, doesn't have a purpose apart from to be what it is, which I think is kind of beautiful. And so spending time with something that's kind of useless is a lovely kind of discipline that really connects me to, reflect on what is purposeful, but also just to be okay. It's okay. I don't have to have this higher calling or higher purpose. It's okay to sort of to be me and to sit. I wouldn't necessarily use this language, but to sort of sit in God's presence, and for that to be an intentional time, maybe to light a candle while I did it. That I like kind of adding those kind of things to it. So it's not really necessarily about particular games, but then there are games which then I think I find other stuff from, and some of them are really violent, like The Last of Us. I love that, and I count that as a very spiritual, healthy story that's full of God, basically. And I love that there's violence in it because it mirrors the violence in the Bible. And so I love the fact that if you're challenged, like, how could you love that? Because it's like so violent. Well, like, I've kind of learned how to do that by my history as a Christian. We're really good at having this really violent text and not letting the violence eclipse what's amazing and useful in it.
I say that to people all the time, or I just ask, people that a lot of times it's Game of Thrones. Like, oh, how could you watch Game of Thrones? I'm like, look, there's nothing new under the sun. There's nothing you're going to see in Game of Thrones that you can't open your Old Testament right now and find. Like, it's there, man.
Songs of Solomon.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Well, and I think it's important to, even around something like Game of Thrones is the more glaring example, but The Last of Us, none of us are saying, and nor would we say like, oh yeah, like this is going to be great for everybody. Go play it right now, and you'll be a better Christian because of it. We're not saying that, but there is a context in which, I think there's a context in which you can engage some of those things, and they're not for everybody. They're not going to be healthy for everybody, but there's a context in which you can engage it and get something out of it, I think.
Yeah, like you probably wouldn't point someone to regime change or genocide in the Bible as the place to start. You might even say the same thing. We're not saying that everybody should read about Tamar or whatever getting chopped up. But there is a context where that's obviously included for an important reason. And so at the right time for the right person, it's really good. But I hear what you're saying. But I'm fascinated by kind of the need to kind of be careful around it when we're probably maybe not as careful around the Bible. Like maybe
totally,
some of those passages we have a blind spot because of how dark they are.
Yeah, I mean, to be frankly honest, there's parts of the Bible that right now I don't want my kids to read.
Yeah. Or like Noah's Ark for a start.
Yeah, I mean, there's some gnarly stuff in there.
The quintessential kid story of Noah's Ark.
Yeah, we decorate around here.
Dude.
Around here in the States, this is probably true in the UK to some degree too, but there's churches that like decorate their kids area with
Noah's Ark.
The happy-go-lucky ark,
Yeah.
Which is weird.
The rising water. Yeah. And the rainbow. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a I don't know what you call it, like it's not an amusement park, but that's the word I want to use. It's not the right word. There's like an amusement park here in the States that has a life-size replica of Noah's Ark that you can go.
It's like a museum, I think.
Tour.
Right?
It's a museum. That's a better word. But I think when it was announced, they made it sound like it was going to be an amusement park, which I don't think.
Have dinosaurs?
I think that's just.
Do they have dinosaurs in it? I might have heard of it.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it's
wow.
It totally does.
Does it?
Like real ones, they real
dino.
Right. Yeah, okay. Dino DNA. Dino DNA.
So it's Jurassic Park mixed with Noah's Ark.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, but one last question before we go. We're kind of running out of time here, but I'd be curious to hear now that you've sort of like parted ways is the wrong word, but you're not you're not married to the church in the same way that you were. Like your involvement has changed for sure. What does like the practice of your faith look like at home with your kids and things? Because what do you guys do? I'm just curious.
So I think what my hope is to model a sort of an open faith to them. So they engage with lots of different kind of spiritual stuff. Some of it's Christian and some of it isn't. And I'm broadly, we'll do stuff together. So mealtime is really important, and festivals are really important in the home. And again, but part of that spills over into regular video game times are important as well. So it's that kind of mix. But my main hope for them is that they don't think that what we see is what we get. That there's more to the world than just physical matter. And I think all three of them have a bit of that, but in very much their own ways. And so, no, they wouldn't call themselves Christians, but they are very happy to engage that there's more to life than just what we see. And I guess I'm sort of comfortable with that. And then in my own life, I work hard. So although I don't go to a Sunday service, I'd still say I'm connected to the church because I have a really wide network of people who are in the church, sort of post-church, like in Sunday church, or maybe pre-church, some people who are looking and asking questions about it, and I'm like, oh, maybe you should try, go to a meeting and see what you think. Or and so I think that kind of being open to dialogue is really important. And that's the thing I love the most, is the idea of holding an opinion really strongly in a community that will hold different opinions very strongly, and not letting one cancel the other out, so that you have a proper dialogue, is something which that's what I'm trying to model to them. Yeah. Whether they get it or not, I don't know, but that gives you a taste.
Well, I heard through the grapevine that you're a really good dad 23% of the time.
Yeah,
so
23, yeah. Sometimes even 24.
Yeah, you are well on your way.
Yeah, that's right.
So where can people find you and all your stuff? We've talked a lot about it, but I don't think we ever actually said where people can go to find all of it.
Yeah, so taminggaming.com is where the database is. There's also there's on the menu, you can go to book, and then you can get the first chapter of the book for free, and find the book there. Or you could just Google Taming Gaming book, and you'll probably go straight to the book, which is on Amazon, or other less capitalist booksellers. I don't know. People complain like
less
that.
spacefaring retailers.
Exactly. And then on Twitter, I'm Geek Dad Gamer, and I'm always very happy to have chats and conversations. A lot of people will reach out to me on Twitter, and we'll have a DM chat, and they'll be like, "Oh, you responded?" And I'm like, "Oh, let's have a phone chat. Well, let's jump on a call." And I get a lot from just being quite generous with time with people, but it's not really generous, because that's how I get kind of fed, really, and kind of that's the sort of bread and butter of what kind of drives most of the stuff I do, are these little individual stories. So I'm always keen to talk to any mum, dad, auntie, grandparent about what are games in your life and your kids' lives and that sort of stuff.
One other thing I did want to mention that's kind of cool that we didn't touch on is that you have a TED Talk. Do you want to mention that real quick? Do you still point people to that?
Yeah, I'm kind of in the works of doing another one, really, but it's kind of what started off a lot of this stuff. It was back in 2012, and it was kind of a challenge to combine my kind of the theology study I'd done with this sort of video game work I was just starting to do. And so I kind of fold one into the other and kind of use kind of the theological tools I was learning, but then apply them to video games, and sort of uncover the fact that video games are this pool of meaning that we're not capitalizing upon, which could really help us make sense of life. And although it's 2012 and it's a long time ago, I still would stand by it. It still is kind of one of the seeds that's carried on and has led to lots of other things. So that is still there. If you Googled Andy Robertson TED Talk or TEDx Talk, then that would pop up.
But yeah, go check that out, and definitely check out Taming Gaming, and the database are all super helpful. So thanks, Andy. This was great having you on. It did not disappoint. It lived up to my expectations.
Good. I really enjoyed it as well. I'm like, oh, I guess we're talking about this. Okay, let's go for it. It's nice. It's nice to be open about these things.